For the first time in 21 years tomorrow, the Mariners will play in the postseason. It feels so good to finally say that. We're going to get you set for the wild card round and visit with Locked On Seahawks host Corbin Smith to talk about his Blue Jays here on the Locked On Mariners podcast. Colby, hit it.
You are Locked On Mariners, your daily Seattle Mariners podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
It is Thursday, October 6th, 2022. How's it going, everyone? This is Ty Gonzalez and Colby Patnode for the Locked On Mariners podcast here. Thank you so much for making us your first listen. Subscribe, like, and turn on alerts if you're watching on YouTube, or subscribe and leave a 5-star review on your preferred podcast platform if you like what you hear. And if you want to hear from us even more, please consider signing up for our Patreon. The link as well as our social accounts is in the description below. On the show today, it is all about the Mariners and the Blue Jays who are playing each other in the wild card round starting tomorrow. We'll give you our thoughts on the series as a whole, how the pitching matchups are lining up, and check in with Locked On Seahawks host Corbin Smith to talk about his Blue Jays a little later on. But first, Colby, I want to ask you, because you were at the last Mariners playoff game, and now you're an old man, and the Mariners are back in the postseason. And I'm kind of wondering how or what your emotions are right now heading into tomorrow's game, because we've talked about this a lot. We prepared for this. We've spent the last few shows talking all about this. We know the Mariners are in the postseason, but it just still doesn't feel real, at least to me. So are you nervous? Are you excited? Are you both? What's kind of going on through your head right now as we approach tomorrow?
Both. Back to you. No.
Squidward.
Yeah.
Good.
Today's show is never going to go well, but it's mostly excitement. There are a lot of nerves though, because I think we know the Mariners are going to advance in the playoffs. They're going to do it by winning a bunch of close games, and it'd be nice to have even in a 6-0 game or something like that. Though you never feel safe in the playoffs, but it'd be nice to have one of those, nice, easy 4-1 games, and we just kind of coast to the end. But that's not going to happen. Not in Toronto. Toronto's too good. That ballpark is too much of a headache to play in. You're going to play some tight games, and there's going to be moments where somebody's going to have to make a big play, or they're going to have to, get a big hit. And so there's a lot of excitement, in just seeing the Mariners in the postseason and, kind of announcing to the rest of the baseball world that, you're here and you're not going anywhere. This isn't a one-off. We're not, like in 2018, if they had snuck in, you'd be like, well, this is kind of their last shot, and then they got to still think about resetting it here. No, this is them opening the door. It's just been opened. And every round they can advance is really a bonus, but you don't want to think of it that way, because you do want to win the World Series, right? I mean, that's still the goal, but it's kind of this weird thing with Mariner fans right now where you got in, and that's kind of been like the goal for forever, is just to get in. And you don't want to say you're satisfied with that, because you do want to win the World Series, obviously, but you also don't want to belittle the accomplishment of breaking the drought itself. So it's mostly nerves and excitement. It's those two things. And I imagine it'll actually get cranked up on Saturday, because either the Mariners will be facing elimination, or they'll have a chance to advance to the DS and play the Astros. And so elimination games are always a little more hype than just game one or game 3 game 3 in the CS or whatever. Every game matters, every pitch matters. And because the Mariners play with incredibly tight margins, every single mistake that they make, and they will make mistakes because they're human. It's baseball. Mistakes are going to happen. And just every single one of those is going to be now like the greatest difficulty the franchise has ever overcome. JP Crawford boots a ground ball in the 3rd inning. You're like, oh my God, nope, here comes the home run. It's going to be 2-0. And then Castillo's going to fall apart and blah, blah, blah. And then what's going to happen? Well, probably a double play. And you'll be like, oh, okay, well, it's just that high and then the low and then the high and the low. It's going to be something. In that case, I am kind of grateful that they're playing at 1:00. Not like, late at night, like a 7:00 game. And then I got to try to go to sleep afterwards. So it's mostly excitement for tomorrow, also mixed with nerves, and then Saturday will be pretty much all nerves because again, one way or the other, a team's facing elimination on Saturday. So we'll see how it goes.
Yeah, there's a lot of nerves. And, going back to kind of how Mariners fans as a whole are feeling about this, it's kind of, now you get to a point here where you're trying to learn how to set the same goals that every other fan of a contender sets, really. It's now you're just kind of, you're a normal baseball fan. You don't have this drought hanging over your head where like that's the only thing I'm thinking about and focused on. It's like, no, now I'm like every other fan where the goal is to win the World Series. The goal is to win, to not just get into the dance, but to make some noise, and so it's really interesting. And I still haven't really like registered in my head that the Mariners are in the postseason, that I'm gonna go to it, that because this is the first time I've ever gone to a playoff game of any kind. Doesn't matter if it's baseball, football, whatever. This is the first time I've ever gone to any sort of playoff game. This is the highest leverage of any game I've ever gone to. I've never experienced an atmosphere like the one that I expect to experience tomorrow and Saturday and maybe even Sunday. We'll see. And so there's a lot of nerves kind of tied with that. I have seen the Rogers Center, sold out and full, but like that was opening day, and that's, different. The stakes are a lot different. That's just excitement. This is pressure. This is one of these teams is going home. One of these teams' amazing journeys that they've gone on this whole year that we followed for the last 6 months is going to end here in this building. And so, for me, I don't want to say that I'm necessarily satisfied, right, if the Mariners, get eliminated this weekend. But I also, I'm very proud of what they've been able to accomplish. They've given us so many great memories, and I've made peace with the fact that at the very least, I'm going to be able to see this team off. I'm going to be able to thank them in my own way and being there and being present. And at best, I get to see them beat the Blue Jays, move on to the ALDS, and we get this thing really rolling. And so either way, I feel good about it. And there's a comfort to find as well in the fact that, they are just getting started, like you said. They are just getting started. This is a young team that still has so much flexibility, roster, payroll, all that stuff. They're going to get better. And so they're going to be in a position where they do just have a flat out scary roster top to bottom like the Blue Jays have, right? Because I think we look at that roster right now and it's like, oh my God, look at all the stars they have in their lineup, and they have pretty good pitching. Like, how are we going to beat this team? I mean, the Mariners are also a really good roster, don't get me wrong, but like there's the potential to get even better and better and better. And so that's what excites me, and that's what makes me ultimately feel good about this no matter what the outcome is. But yeah, at the end of the day, I obviously want them to win, and I'm going to be disappointed as hell, and I'm going to be depressed if they lose, especially on that train ride home. That is going to be the worst train ride home if that's, what happens. And also it's probably going to ruin my my experience at Rogers Center in the future even further because I'm always going to be reminded of it. So
no, can't go back to the parking garage because it makes me feel sad.
Yeah, the
Rogers Center is ugly.
Garage. It's so ugly. I really appreciated all of the comments when I posted a certain photo that I definitely could not show on this broadcast on Twitter of me at Rogers Center on New Year's Day this past year, and the amount of people that were saying, God, that's such an ugly building. It really is. They're renovating it for next season, but it's mostly like on field stuff or stuff that you would see on the field, like in the stands and whatnot. They're putting in a little patio or something in right field and all this stuff. But yeah.
Just saying, Canada has to have one good baseball stadium in it. So why not just tear the thing down and start over?
Yeah. Yeah, and they've talked about that in the past, but I don't think that's actually what they're going to end up doing. I think they're just going to renovate this thing.
I like the look of Tropicana Field more than I do the Rogers Center.
God, that is saying something. Yeah, it's take it from me, folks. It is not a great ballpark, and if you are visiting the Rogers Center this weekend for the first time, you will learn that yourself. It's not ideal. But hey, that's where the Mariners are going to play their first playoff game in 21 years, and their first playoff series in 21 years. And let's just go for the ride, right? All right, so we'll get into the series a little bit more here and talk about what's going on with pitching matchups, what we kind of think the roster is going to look like. There's some more information on Cade Marlowe potentially and how he might fit into all this. So we'll get into all that coming up here in just a moment, and we'll also talk to Corbin Smith in just a moment. But real quick, a reminder, this episode of Locked On Mariners is brought to you by BetOnline, as I need to get the overlay up here. All right, let's do this. BetOnline.net is your number one source for football betting info this season. Find all the latest player developments, team matchups, news, podcasts, and in-depth articles and analysis on every game you can find. And as always, BetOnline remains your continued source for all your sport wagering information with live betting and up-to-the-minute scores for every sport out there. It is the fastest and easiest way to check in on all your favorite games and events, including MLB, MMA, boxing, and golf. Head to betonline.net or use your mobile device to learn more. BetOnline is where the game starts. You're listening to the Locked On Mariners podcast. Thank you again for making us your first listen. So, Colby, we have some clarity when it comes to the pitching matchups now. It looks like Logan Gilbert is going to be starting game 3 if the game 3 is necessary, and we'll see if maybe George Kirby gets used out of the bullpen at some point in one of these games. That's certainly a possibility as well. But let's talk about what's going on the Toronto side of things. We know that Alek Manoah is starting game 1 for Toronto, but game 2 and game 3 is where it gets a little bit murky. But there are some that cover the Blue Jays that are saying that the Blue Jays are going to go with Ross Stripling in game 2 if they win game 1. And then if they lose game 1, they're going to go with Kevin Gausman, strikeout specialist, potential Cy Young candidate, who's dealing with a cut on his right middle finger right now. But basically, they want to save him for an elimination game rather than the dagger. So what do you think about that from the Blue Jays side of things and that strategy?
It is a slap in the face of the Seattle Mariners, and it is bulletin board material. Also, the Mariners crushed Kevin Gausman, so yeah, take that. 6 innings, 2 runs against that bad Mariners lineup. What a scrub. It's interesting to see how Toronto kind of views this. And Stripling, for the record, has been very good this year. He's a very solid pitcher. He had a 3.1 FWAR for the year. Granted, only 124 innings, but he's a guy who is a pretty interesting matchup against Seattle. He's in the past, he has been very fly ball heavy. This year it was more ground ball oriented. He doesn't miss a tremendous amount of bats. At least this year he hasn't. But he also doesn't walk guys. So he's going to be around the zone. So that is an interesting matchup for the Mariners, who kind of live and die by the home run and the walk. And if you're not going to walk guys, which, by the way, Gausman, Manoah, and Stripling, none of them do. So it's an interesting dynamic they're rolling with. It feels backwards to me because if you feel good enough about Stripling in a, clinch scenario, then start him in game 3. I think if you're down if you're up 1-0, you don't want to get to a game 3 because game 3s are where anything can happen. Elimination games are crazy. There is pitching matchup lineup. It doesn't throw it out. It's an elimination. It's one baseball game to decide your season. Literally anything can happen. So you do not want to get to game 3 if you can help it. So to me, it feels like the Blue Jays should be doing what the Mariners are doing and just throwing their 2 best in game 1 and 2. And, hope that you win at both of them, ideally, but at least one of them. So we'll see. It's interesting. The Mariners have beaten Manoah this year. They have beaten Gausman this year, but those 2 guys pitched very well in those games. And it was, they gave up a couple runs, and it just so happened that the guys that they were facing were a little bit better. So that's kind of how you're going to have to win this game. So I think it's backwards. Stripling's had a very nice year, and if you want to trust him in a game 3, like a win-or-go-home game, I think that's totally legitimate strategy on their part. It just feels like you always want to put the dagger in as soon as possible. You don't want to mess around and get this thing to a situation where, anything can happen. And you say, oh, well, we can use Gausman in an elimination game. It's like, well, yeah, but what if Gausman gives up 3 home runs in 5 innings? game over. You don't have that buffer. So I just, it feels weird to me. It feels backwards. But it's again, I don't want to disrespect Ross Stripling. He's been very good this year. It just feels like you paid Kevin Gossman all that money, use him in the elimination game.
Yeah, it feels like that's what you pay him for, is to pitch in those kinds of moments. And so to not, you're using him as the guy to basically save you rather than to end it. It's weird to me. It's really strange to me. And look, make him pay. Win game 1, force Gossman into game 2, see what happens. So
right. Winning game 1 is so important too, because it forces your opponent to, it's all hands on deck. And in the playoffs, it usually is anyways, right? It's only 3 games in a row. You're going to get Monday off. You're not going to be afraid to, use the same reliever all 3 games, but it does change things, because if let's say the Mariners win, right? And Ray goes out there and he gives up 2 runs in the first, but you're up 1-0 in the series. You might be able to say, okay, let's see, we'll still be on high alert, but let's just see how he looks in the second. If you're Toronto and you're down 1-0 and Gossman goes up there and he gives up a 3-run homer to Carlos Santana or whatever, it's sound the alarms, get the bullpen hot. We have got to get this guy out of here. So winning game 1 is incredibly important. It's not like you can't win the series if you lose game 1. Of course you can. You can only win 2 games in a row, and it's not that hard, but it does put everybody at ease when you have the one game in your back pocket and you only have to win 1 of the next 2 instead of both of them. And it does change how you manage the game.
And we'll see how the cut on his right middle finger impacts Gossman, if at all. Don't know what it's like or anything like that, but maybe that does have an impact on him. Maybe he's not exactly the Kevin Gossman that we know, so that also works in the Mariners' favor.
Yeah, maybe he only has like 80% of the control he normally has on his splitter, or maybe he can't throw the splitter as much as he normally does, or maybe it's the fastball movement that takes a backseat. You never know with stuff like that, so we'll see how it goes. But I think Toronto is doing this backwards, but what do I know?
So the big thing for me in this series, and I think what this is ultimately going to come down to, is the defense. These are 2 really good defensive teams. Toronto has especially reinforced its defensive unit with Whit Merrifield and Jackie Bradley Jr. as of late. So they play really good defense there. They don't make a ton of mistakes. They were 10th in errors this year. The Mariners, I think, were 4th. They finished. And so I think it's going to be really who comes down to, or who ends up making that key mistake. Especially for the Mariners, on the Mariners side of things, they can't avoid that, or they have to avoid that rather, because we saw in that Rangers series all those years back between the Rangers and the Blue Jays, the Jose Bautista game. What happened in the Jose Bautista inning? The Rangers defense melted. It melted, and that stadium got going. And it's game over at that point. If that stadium gets going with as many young guys as you have on your team, and look, we can talk about all the talent in the world and all this stuff, but it is going to impact certain guys mentally. It just is.
Yep.
This is a different kind of sport that the Mariners are going to be playing tomorrow. It is not the exact same sport that they were playing on Wednesday against the Tigers. It's completely different.
Right. It's also a young team. There's not a ton of guys with playoff experience. And the big crowds that the Mariners have played in front of this year, and there's been a few of them, they've been at home for the most part, and maybe some low stake road games. So it's just different. It's going to be, you have to see how Julio responds to that. Logan Gilbert, if they get to a game 3, you don't know how he's going to respond. Even a veteran like Luis Castillo, he's pitched in 1 playoff game. That's it. Robbie Ray, I think, has pitched in 3. It's just different. It is, and so it's interesting to see how this young team, it's also a coaching staff that doesn't have a ton of experience managing in the playoffs. It's a very young group and very inexperienced group. And this is why you need guys like Carlos Santana, who has a ton of experience in the playoffs. You need him to be there. You need even somebody who doesn't have playoff experience, but is the calming presence like Mitch Haniger. These are the guys that need to step up, and they need to kind of take over the clubhouse more or less without feeling like they are overstepping. Right?
Yeah, where they're changing the dynamic, basically.
Right.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's tough, and Adam Frazier's got some playoff experience. Marco's got a little bit of playoff experience, even though he's not going to be on the roster. Gino, I think, has a couple games. there's just not a lot of
Castillo.
Luis has one. Yeah.
Yeah.
There's just not a lot of playoff experience on the roster, and it's going to be different. And that might actually help because you don't know what you don't know, right? You don't have any bad habits. But it also could hurt when the things get tight. And that's why you kind of want that, Eugenio Suarez. You don't want, when Kelnick strikes out with the bases loaded, you want Gino right there talking to him. You want his head back in the game. And so, yeah, the veterans, I think if the Mariners are going to progress throughout the playoffs, it's going to be the young guys. It's going to be Julio. It's going to be Cal. It's going to be, Jared and Logan and George. And it's going to be those guys that push them. That's the ceiling for the Mariners. But I think because of that, it's incredibly important that the team gets something of value from Haniger and Gino and Marco and just some of the guys who have played a lot more baseball than their young teammates. So it's a bit of a, balancing act there, but we'll see, how valuable Mitch Haniger's leadership is and all the things about Carlos Santana's playoff experience. We'll see if it helps or not. And we probably won't know because it could help. It could be tremendously helpful and they could get swept. Right. So,
and look, on the flip side of things too, this is also a very young Blue Jays team. Obviously they have the experience of guys like George Springer, etc., but they also, Alek Manoah is going to start his first playoff game in front of a sold out crowd in Toronto. I mean, there are nerves that go along with that. So it works for both sides as well. And so that's also what makes this series in general so unpredictable, because there are so many parallels between between these two teams. And it's just really who cracks at the end of the day. So I'm really interested to see how that plays out. And I think that it does ultimately come down to the defense for one of these teams, specifically the Mariners. So if the Mariners can play their good fundamental ball and can sustain that through these next 2 to 3 games, then I think they're going to be in a good spot. If they can just play their ball, which is run prevention ball, they should be able to win at least 2 of these games.
Do you think we're going to see, are they going to try and do things differently at all than what they did in the regular season? Are we going to see more like 5th inning bunts or maybe some hit and runs or anything like that? Or are they just going to, stick with the formula that got them here, which is, find a way on base and hope somebody hits a home run?
Well, it depends on how the games are going, right? If they end up getting to a point where the pitching falls off the rails and they have to get into a shootout, then they're just going to have to,
Or they just swing for it. But
yeah.
Well, let me ask you the different direction. Who on this team would you trust to put down a sacrifice bunt, like a good one?
Adam Frazier.
Okay.
And
end of list,
pretty much.
Yeah.
JP Crawford is awful at it. Dylan Moore is awful at
Sucks.
it. Yeah.
Can Cade Marlowe bunt? I don't think you want to put him. Hey, kid, welcome to the show. Go lay down this incredibly crucial sacrifice bunt for us.
So thank you for mentioning Cade Marlowe, because I almost hopped off of here and moved on to our interview with Corbin without talking about Cade Marlowe. Yes, of course. So Cade Marlowe, we talked about him yesterday because you read the tweet live as we were recording, and I reacted in a great way. And we talked about he's probably just going to be on the taxi squad, whatever. It might be a little bit of insurance, but I also talked about hey, he might give you some value on the base pass, and that might help you with the loss of Sam Haggerty at least a little bit. Obviously, he's not the same runner like Sam Haggerty, but he does give you some value on the base pass. This team needs some form of athleticism that it can get, because it's just not a very athletic team, and they lost a lot of that with the loss of Sam Haggerty. And now, as it turns out, Ryan Divish really believes that Cade Marlowe is going to be on the postseason roster. So how does that work, Colby?
I would assume that he's taking the spot of who we thought would be Taylor Trammell, because ideally neither one of them gets an at bat, right? You don't want to be in a position where you have to use either one of them and rely on them to get a hit or whatever. So when you kind of start looking, okay, then what is the ideal scenario to use Trammell? Well, late inning defensive replacement and base runner, pinch runner, but Trammell's not a tremendous base stealer. Marlowe is a very good base stealer. And the defense, I think, is, based on what I've read about Cade Marlowe's defense, it's probably about as good as Trammell in left field. it's maybe a tick down, but again, the base running value greatly overcompensates for that. And Trammell hasn't hit like at all for the last month or so. And Marlowe, even though he's, hasn't hit big league pitching ever before, he's had a very good year throughout, the entire minor league system. So if you do have to go up there and have him take some hacks, the Mariners probably feel better about Marlowe at the plate than they do Trammell. So I think that's probably what we're looking at here. That's the role that Marlowe is going to serve. Basically, he's the 26th guy, and Mitch Haniger gets on base in the 8th of a tied game. Marlowe's probably coming in to run. That's probably how it's going to go. So we'll see. Cut to him getting the game-winning RBI in the 13th inning on Sunday. But I think mostly just going to be, defense and base running. And, I think if Marlowe got an at-bat, it probably meant something went wrong. And I'm totally prepared for him to hit leadoff against Kevin Gossman on Sunday. But I don't think that
I don't know if Service would do that necessarily, but
I don't. Maybe there's something to the idea of Toronto doesn't have anything on this guy, right? Their scouts have something on Marlowe, but not much, right? They weren't anticipating Cade Marlowe being on the Mariners playoff roster, so surprise.
Yeah,
but I think it's just defense base running. Basically, he's taking Sam Haggerty's role, just minus taking any of his at bats. As weird as that sounds.
Yeah, more or less. So, all right. Before we move on to Corbin, let me get predictions series. Who's winning? How many games?
Well, the winner will win 2 times. I think that's. I don't know. There's much wiggle room in that. I don't know. I mean, we'll be back on Friday. How about you ask me on the post game show Friday?
No.
I will. Like I said this on Baseball Things, Jason Churchill's podcast. I'm not going to be the guy who picks against the Mariners. I'm not doing that. So I'll take the Mariners. I think it'll probably take them all 3 games to get it done. I think what we're going to see, how Seattle's going to win. I think Castillo's going to pitch well in game 1. I think Ray will be fine, but I think the bats will probably go pretty quiet against Gossman. And then I think in game 3, I think we're going to see, I'll call it. I'll just call my shot. Game winning home run in the top of the 9th off of Jordan Romano by, wait for it, Dylan Moore. Boom. There it is. Playoff Demo will become a thing.
He bought in. I did it, folks. I made him crack.
I only bought in so that you have to buy the T-shirts.
Playoff Demo is going to be a thing, and playoff Jared. Playoff Jared is going to be a thing.
Do you think Demo gets any at bats in this series?
Yes, facing
all righties.
I think he ends up getting an at bat because he came in as a defensive replacement at some point.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well,
so and that's going to be the at bat, Colby. The at bat that you're talking about. M's in 3, folks.
All right,
let's go for it. Let's ride, let's sail, let's fly, let's do all those things.
Hold on. What do you think's more likely, Ty? Before we go, Mariners win in 2, or Blue Jays win in 3.
Blue Jays 1 and 3. I'd be surprised if because it's the Mariners,
is the Mariners
right?
winning in 2 the least likely scenario?
Yeah. It's the Mariners. If they're going to win the series, they're going to make it as difficult and as stressful as possible.
There's a 0% chance the Mariners just roll into Toronto and win 5-1 and 7-2.
They're gonna break us emotionally. They are going to break us emotionally, no matter what happens this weekend.
I cannot wait for Saturday when Luis Torrens is pitching in the 9th inning because the Mariners are up 13-2. It'll be glorious.
I hope this is something we can clip in a few days and play back because the Mariners did just that. All right, let's talk to a man who thinks that's definitely not going to happen. Corbin Smith, host of the Locked On Seahawks podcast.
He's a football guy.
Corbin Smith, host of the Locked On Seahawks podcast, who is, yes, indeed, a football guy and also a Blue Jays fan.
Hoser.
And has made his followers know that he's a Blue Jays fan the last couple of days, and they've let him know back what they think about that. So please, let's all give Corbin a warm welcome of booze down in the chat below. And we'll see you on the other side. Bye. Corbin Smith is the host of the Locked On Seahawks podcast. He's also a credentialed reporter covering the Seahawks over at allseahawks.com, where he used to be my boss, and we're still pals, even though he's a dirty Blue Jays fan, and that's why I have him on here today. So, Corbin, I think a lot of people are aware of your Blue Jays fandom, but for those that might not know, how did your love for the Blue Jays begin? Why are you not a Mariners fan?
Well, I'm from Northern Indiana, and I think a lot of people don't realize geography. Toronto is not that far away from Northern Indiana. Detroit's like 2.5 hours, and then you just go across to Toronto. It's not that long of a drive. And ironically, I've never been to a Blue Jays game, but I've been rooting for the Blue Jays since I was a little kid. And I remember my first favorite player was Carlos Delgado, and a lot of our listeners are probably thinking, well, Indiana, there's no way there's a lot of Blue Jays fans, but you'd be surprised. There's actually, I'd say it's probably third or fourth behind Chicago Cubs are clearly number one. There's tons of Cubs fans there, a lot of St. Louis Cardinals fans in Indiana, and you have quite a few Cincinnati Reds fans. But I would say that the Blue Jays are right there behind those three teams because, location-wise, it's not that far away. So, yeah, I grew up rooting for Delgado and Sean Green. And, I mean, they had some incredible bats on those teams in the late 90s, early 2000s. But they had struggles with pitching, which is why they didn't make the playoffs any of those seasons. And so they had some really good teams that ended up missing the playoffs. If they had the format now where they had the extra wild card, they probably would have made the playoffs a couple of those seasons. But nonetheless, that's where my fandom started because they could hit the long ball, and it was a lot of fun to watch.
Yeah, Carlos Delgado was a lot of fun. Vernon Wells, Alex Rios, all those names. Great. There's some really, really fun teams up in Toronto. So, it's been a while since since these two teams have met. These teams have changed quite a bit since the trade deadline, all that. So for Mariners fans who haven't really paid much attention to the Jays since the last time they saw them, what's changed? What's going on with this team? What should we be looking for this weekend?
It just feels like they've been a little bit more consistent since they changed managers. And I never felt like Montoya was necessarily a bad manager, but it was one of those instances where they were 46-42 at the time. And this team has way too much talent to be crawling just a little bit above 500. And they didn't make the playoffs last year, narrowly missed out. It just seemed like this team had been chronically underachieving. And so they've been 48-28 since John Schneider. Ironically, not John Schneider for the Seahawks, but John Schneider here at the Blue Jays takes over. They've been much better, been much more consistent. It feels like the pitching has been the area where they've been able to turn the tide a little bit because the first half of the season, the bullpen, I don't know how many games they choked away in the first 2.5 months. And while it's still not necessarily a strength team, it does seem like the bullpen has been more consistent in the second half of the season. And that's why they were able to get that top wild card spot. The bats have been there all year, maybe not quite as prolific as I thought they were going to be early in the season. Vladdy Guerrero's stat line, most guys in the major leagues would take that, but 274 from Vladdy, that's kind of underwhelming. So their bats have been good, but maybe good as I anticipated. Second half of the season, though, they've been driving in a lot of runs. They're hitting the ball out of the park. The pitching's been a little bit more consistent. So I think that's really the difference here, because when these teams met last time, that was near the end of the failed tenure for Montoya. Then they changed managers shortly after. That was kind of the series, I think, that set the table for them to make that move.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. There's definitely been a clear change with this team over the last couple of months. And I'm glad that you mentioned the bullpen because, the narrative right now on the Blue Jays bullpen is, well, it sucks. It's one of the worst in the league. Well, not necessarily. Over the last month or so, it's been top 10 in F4. So they've been a very valuable unit, and they're pitching a lot better lately. So we'll see how that goes. So I want to ask you because, you're so, obviously you're not a Mariners fan and you're not really involved in that scene in any way, but you are deeply ingrained in the Seattle sports scene. And we're starting to see the Mariners' success leak over into other areas of Seattle sports. Like yesterday, we saw DK Metcalf rocking the Mariners shirt and all that. How much, from the outside kind of looking in, from your perspective, how much have the Mariners truly taken over in the city of Seattle? How much has this become a baseball town once again over the last few months?
I think you've really been able to see it the last, I'd say, 3 or 4 months, really, since Julio came up. That really was the thing that changed everything. This team almost made the playoffs last year, so there was a lot of hope. And then the start of the season was very underwhelming. And I believe they were 30-39 at one point. And so the turnaround that they were able to make, that really fueled, with Julio Rodriguez, of course, being the face of that resurgence, that really fueled this movement with fans. And, I think everybody was thinking that this was going to become the Mariners town about 3 weeks ago when the Seahawks got beat 27-7 by the 49ers. Everybody's like, okay, that's the team we expect the Seahawks to beat. But now Seattle's 2-2 in the NFL. So maybe the Seahawks aren't quite ready to relinquish all of that control as the top team in Seattle. But the Mariners have a great opportunity now, being in the postseason for the first time since 2001. They've got a great chance now to take even more away from the Seahawks, who everybody is still thinking, probably not a playoff. But if Geno keeps wheeling and dealing the way he is, then hey, maybe we can play with house money. And NFC's good, but this is a great opportunity for the Mariners now to further steal the hearts of the fans in Seattle and try to truly turn this back into a baseball town, which I wasn't here when it was considered a baseball town, but all the fans I've talked to, the reporters I've talked to, they're like, this place is going to be nuts if they get any home playoff games. They're obviously not going to get that in this series against Toronto, but if they can advance, then they'll get an opportunity to have their first playoff games in Seattle in 21 years.
Yeah, it's pretty wild to think that, this Sunday, if Mariners Blue Jays require game 3, that game would start about an hour after the Seahawks game against the Saints starts. And it's crazy to think that, not a lot of people in Seattle will be watching that Seahawks game until replay because of the Mariners playing. It's pretty wild to see this shift over the last year or so and how quick it's become and how pretty much aligned these two teams are and kind of going separate ways. But like you said, right, Geno Smith is playing incredibly well right now. The Seahawks actually look fairly competent, at least offensively, and maybe not defensively, but they at least are having some success. So they're not completely going away. It's nice to have two teams that are at least finding some success at the same exact time. Now, how do you think the Blue Jays will win this series, and how do you think they'll lose it?
A lot of people are going to expect me to say slugging their way out of this series. And obviously, if they're able to smash a bunch of home runs, that is going to improve their odds of winning this series. But pitching is what wins when you get into October. And as I mentioned, their pitching has been better. It's been more consistent as of late. They're going to be starting Manoah in game 1 of this series. So they've got this set up exactly how they want it going into the playoffs. They got to take advantage of it. They have to be able to pitch their way to the next series. I think they're going to be able to get some runs on the board. This offense has too many bats. But pitching is going to have to step up because the Mariners are one of those teams. It's weird. You look at their batting averages and stuff. You're like, that offense isn't that great. But they put runs on the board. They find ways to get it done, and they do it in an exciting fashion a lot of times. They kind of have this Seahawks DNA. They just have that. They have that lure for the dramatic, and so you want to keep those bats subdued as much as you can. It really boils down to pitching for the Blue Jays. If their pitching doesn't come through, then the Mariners are going to probably come to Toronto and they're going to win this series. But if the pitching be good enough to go with the bats that they have, I've been saying this all year, the Blue Jays have enough talent to make a run in the playoffs and push one of those top 2 teams in the American League. They've played well against the Yankees this year. They've won some games against the Astros this year, but it's just been inconsistent, and I don't think they've peaked. They might be one of those teams like the Braves last year that can get in the playoffs and play their best baseball. They've been playing better as of late, so we'll see. But to me, it all boils down to pitching because this classic matchups. I would say the Mariners have the better pitching staff going into the series. The Blue Jays have the better lineup. A lot of times, great pitching is going to be great hitting. So the Blue Jays need their pitchers to step up and build off the momentum they've had here the last month or so. And if they're able to do that, then I like their chances of winning this series, especially since they're at home.
Mm-hmm. Now, game 2, I assumed that was going to be Kevin Gausman going on the bump for the Blue Jays, but there's been some talk about potentially Ross Stripling, especially with Gausman dealing with a cut on his finger, maybe to give him an extra day of rest if they have to go to a game 3. What do you think about going to Ross Stripling in game 2 if that ends up being the case?
I'd have great confidence in him. I think he's been one of their best pitchers in the second half of the season. He's quietly put together a really good statistical season. He's efficient. He goes out and gets the job. He can eat up innings too. So I wouldn't have any issue. I'd be confident with him pitching game 2. The one that's been perplexing to me has been Berrios this year because Berrios has the talent. Obviously, they traded away some prospects to get him last year, and he pitched great for him down the stretch. And then this year has been an unmitigated disaster for him, an ERA ballooning above 5. And yet he's a guy when he is on, has anybody on this staff. And so that's been one of the issues with this team. They've just had some guys that were supposed to be good this year that have jet down seasons, ironically, for a 92-win team. And it has felt at times like they've underachieved. And I think the pitching staff, more than anything, has been the case. But Stripling has had a really good year. I'd be confident him going out there. He doesn't have elite stuff by any means, but he gets the most out of his pitches that he has, and he's been effective and has got an ERA in the low 3s. So I would be confident in him pitching if they need him to start one of these first games.
Well, Corbin, thank you again for hopping on here with me and chatting a little bit about your favorite team. I know that you were excited to have an opportunity to just kind of be a fan on a Locked On podcast here. So I'm glad that we could make that happen. Good luck this week. Tell us what's going on Locked On Seahawks and where everyone can find your stuff.
Yeah, we're going to have a new crossover special that's going to be coming up here in the next few hours. It's actually going to be posted with Ross Jackson of Locked On Saints. We did our Matchup Wednesday show yesterday. Get your boxing gloves ready. Marshawn Lattimore and DK Metcalf, the rematch coming up. That's one of the many matchups that Rob Rang and I broke down. But you can find all of our shows just like Locked On Mariners. We're available on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, streaming 5 days a week on YouTube. We're doing 6, 7, 8 episodes a week. So we've really been loading up this season. Tons of great content, tons of analysis and insight. So make sure to check that out on Twitter, _Seahawks. You can follow me at Corbin Smith NFL as well.
All right. Well, thank you to Corbin for joining us once again. And just want to reiterate real quick before we hop off of here. No, this was a really long show. Sorry to our overlords at Locked On. We promise we'll shorten up the episodes next time around, but we'll see. So here's what our plan is for the weekend, in case you didn't listen to yesterday's show where we laid it out. Again, I'm going to the games. It's going to take me about a couple hours to get back home because I got to take the train and everything, and then we'll do the post-game shows pretty much as soon as I get through the door. So the post-game shows are probably... they are going to happen. We are going to get post-game shows out. They're just most likely going to come out about 3 to 4 hours after the game instead of pretty much right after. So if you're, if you're done watching the game and they win or they lose or whatever, and you want to listen to us and you don't see that we have a post-game show out, don't worry. It will be coming. It's just going to be a few hours late. So be on the lookout for that. And we will see you tomorrow. All that good stuff. It's going to be a wild weekend, folks. Let's he does love Tim Hortons. Hoser. It's Corbin hate week, it's Toronto hate week, it's Canada hate week here on the Locked On Mariners podcast. Also, tell us what your thoughts are on bagged milk down in the comments below as well. let us know. All right. So, that's going to do it for our show. Thank you so much for joining us here on the Locked On Mariners podcast. Things are going to be different starting tomorrow. This is a playoff team now officially. Let's just enjoy the hell out of it. Let's sail. How about that? I'm Ty Gonzalez. That's Colby Patnode. Be sure to give us a follow on Twitter at LO_Mariners. Did I point the wrong way? Yeah, I pointed the wrong way. That's Colby Patnode. I hate the mirroring on these cameras. You can follow me at Dane Gonzalez. That's DaneGNZLZ, and Colby at CPAT11. That's CPAT11. You can also find all that stuff in the description of this episode. And thank you again for making us your first listen. Now make your second listen the Locked On MLB podcast. MLB expert Paul Francis Sullivan brings humor, passion, and unique perspective on every team and the biggest stories around the league. Follow the #1 daily league-wide podcast, Locked On MLB, on the Odyssey app, YouTube, and wherever you get your podcasts just like us. And with that, have yourself a beautiful baseball day, and we'll see you tomorrow after the game. Peace.